Beyond 100 days with Nifemi Oguntoye. Let's begin with some updates from the National Assembly, where the Senate has now postponed the screening and possible confirmation of appointments of 7 ministerial nominees forwarded to it by President Tinubu last week. Special Advisor to the President on Media on Senate Matters, Bashir Lado, said the postponement was to allow all nominees conclude all aspects of documentation and pre-screening exercises. President Tinubu had sent a formal request for the screening and confirmation of 7 ministerial nominees last Thursday. On the show today, the Transmission Company of Nigeria has assured that electricity will be restored to affected parts of the north in 5 days. Managing Director of the TCN, Sule Abdulaziz, who spoke in Abuja earlier today, mentioned that the power outage was caused by vandalism and insecurity in the region. Minister of Power Adebayo Adelabu is also advocating capital punishment for vandals of national assets, which he describes as an act of terrorism.
The area affected has been secured with the help of Nigerian Army, and concerted efforts is going on one of the lines' restoration. Restoration of one of the lines will allow TCN to hold about 400 megawatts of power in that corridor.
People are so worried in the north due to the collapse of the national grid across the northern states. The minister, after seeing Mr. President, I met him in his office and he gave me the assurances that in the next 5 days, power will be restored.
It is high time we started having regional grids, or even if possible, state grids, so that each of these grid network on a regional basis, on state basis, will be protected and isolated from each other.
Recall that President Bola Tinubu had expressed concern over the blackout in northern Nigeria, summoning the Minister of Power, Adebayo Adelabu, as well as the National Security Advisor, Nuhu Ribadu, giving an order to ensure quick restoration of electricity. And for more on this development, I'm joined by partner Energy and Natural Resources Group, KPMG, and Chairman LCCI Power Sector Group, Martin Zarugia. Mr. Zarugia, thank you for joining us on the show this evening. The latest blackout in the Northwest has come in just days after we experienced 3 national grid collapses within a single week. Can Nigeria's power grid support the growing demand as we have it now, or do you think it's time to begin to rethink our transmission infrastructure? What do you think is the problem here?
Thanks for having me, Nifemi. And yes, I think that's the appropriate question, whether the transmission infrastructure as we currently have can support our power demands. And the answer clearly is no. And that's something we've known for a fact for quite a few years. The problem is, how do we source the relevant investments to upgrade the transmission infrastructure and ensure that it is able to meet what our demands are. If you speak to the generating companies in Nigeria today, they will tell you that they are able to generate somewhere around 12 to 13,000 megawatts, while on a daily basis, our peak power distributed has never gone beyond about 5,000 megawatts. What tells you is that there is a significant difference between what is available and what gets to the average Nigerian. And that difference can be explained between the bottlenecks in both transmission and distribution infrastructure. When we privatized the power sector, transmission was left solely in the hands of government. So the government still controls the entire transmission value chain as it is today. And we already are aware of how government is stretched across various fronts in terms of funding. So therefore, it's almost impossible to expect that government will find the spare resources to make the relevant investment in the infrastructure, to make the upgrade that is required to bring it up to the point where it can support our power demands and our power needs.
I hear you, Mr. Roque, but how precisely do you see the private sector contribute to upgrading Nigeria's transmission infrastructure without further, laboring the consumers with higher costs?
The truth is, if you are going to get the private sector to come and make that investment, you also need to create the environment for them to be able to recover that investment. And the only way they will be able to recover that investment is from customers and from people being able to use the power and then pay the appropriate value for it. So the appropriate value may be or may not be higher than what we currently pay, but there is no way you can incentivize private sector players to come into a space and expect them to then treat it purely as a social good. It would also be a commercial venture for them, so it needs to make sense also from a commercial perspective. A lot of people have talked a lot about building regional grids, state grids, but a lot of these things are a lot easier to speak about, because when they talk about it, we tend to not even take into cognizance the challenges that we may have with breaking the grid up. As much as we talk about power as a commercial good, it's also a social good. You don't want a scenario where when you break up the grid, there's a lot of focus on areas where people believe that the populace can afford power. And you'll still be left with a scenario like what you have currently now in places in the north, where because people would believe that the resources to pay for power doesn't exist, there will be no investment in the grids in those areas, and therefore they will continue to suffer blackouts like this. So there is a place for a national grid, but we just need to find a way to bring in private sector players to help us strengthen in terms of providing the right resources to strengthen the infrastructure in the grid. Yeah.
You know, prior to this blackout, we've seen some remarkable improvement in power supply. It has gotten to a point where it isn't about whether there is light or not, it's whether you can afford it. And there are also conversations as to whether Nigerians, majority of them, can really afford consistent power supply as we've seen it recently. But let's talk about what seems to be concerns about balancing the need for security measures to prevent vandalism with the economic and social cost of power outages. How can we ensure coordination, for instance, between the Ministry of Power, TCN, and security agencies to prevent future outages?
Okay, so this is a very tricky situation, and it's not very dissimilar to what we've seen in the oil and gas sector in the past, where because of the peculiarity of the sector, you then find that one of the critical costs for players is security. They're either paying security outfits, both private and public, to be able to secure their assets. And that is not conducive for business in any form. As a business enterprise, I should be able to go about doing my business on a day-to-day basis and leave security agencies to be able to do their work and trust that they would secure my assets without me getting involved in the business of security. I think there should be a dichotomy. When we then begin to expect power sector players the same way that expectation became the norm for IOCs in Nigeria to begin to take a major role in security and security planning and all of that, then it takes them away from their core function. And then it is resources that are limited that would have been invested in developing infrastructure that is then spent on this security needs. So yes, in terms of collaboration, what I think the security guys need to be aware of, what I think the Power Ministry, TCN, need to do is basically let them know where those critical assets are located and why those assets need to be protected. I think it should be the sole responsibility of the security operatives to take charge of ensuring that the security needs of this country, including that of the power sector players, are adequately catered for at every point in time. It should not be the business of TCN to get involved in security.
The federal government, recall, earlier this year released official gazette that was tagged Designation and Protection of Critical National Information Infrastructure, and that is seeking to protect national information infrastructure in the telecom sector. There are some who have talked about the need to also work up bills in the area of critical infrastructure across board. But do you think that are there significant world standards that we can benchmark here? How can you heard the Minister of Power talk about capital punishment for vandals? Some say that's quite extreme. Are there alternative deterrents? And what global standard do you think that the power sector can adopt?
Okay. Unfortunately, I'm not a security expert, so I can't speak about security. I can't speak about security and the challenges.
We'll get back to Mr. Roge as we work on that connection. But then there are conversations as to whether or not we are there as a nation to keep our power grid on, and whether it does have the capacity to keep providing us consistency in power, exactly what we currently pay for. Mr. Roge, we lost you for a minute.
Yes, sorry. So I was saying that I'm not a security expert, but I don't think that there is any world acclaimed or any standard from a world perspective in terms of power sector players providing or dealing with security threats. I think that that's a national security issue. It's not a power sector specific issue. Unfortunately, we do have those security issues in Nigeria today, especially up north, because of the vandals and the bandits that we've heard of so far. So, but like I said, I don't think it should be the responsibility of power sector players to put in place a security plan. I think it's that of government and the security agencies, and it's their responsibility to ensure that private sector players have the right and conducive environment, especially from a security standpoint, to continue to provide the services that are critical to the economy.
But do you think capital punishment for vandals is extreme?
Honestly, I'm not I do not support capital punishment. I believe in a justice system that is more geared towards trying to rehabilitate people rather than apply finality to any crime of any sort. I think that if we make sufficient investment in rehabilitating these people, we may see that some of them are able to be reincorporated into society at some point and become very useful people in the society.
Hold that thought. We'll be back with more right after this break. Stay with us, everyone. Power outage in some part of the north is now a national concern. You heard the Northern Governors Forum yesterday talk about it. Mr. President has also summoned the Minister of Power and the National Security Advisor. We are hearing that this will be fixed by the TCN in the next 5 days. But what can we do to ensure a more sustainable system and process when it comes to transmission? Martin Zaroge's partner, Energy and Natural Resources Group, KPMG, and Chairman LCCI Power Sector Group. Thank you for staying the course on the program. Beyond just waiving billing, which the Minister of Power talked about yesterday, and which of course is expected during such blackout, except we're saying that our billing system is faulty, what specific interventions or relief measures would you recommend to mitigate the effects of prolonged blackouts of this nature on, small businesses, vulnerable populations, hospitals, and low-income households? Okay.
Unfortunately, until we completely resolve this issue, I think it's one of the easiest way to do this is primarily, especially for low-income households, is something that a lot of northern governments have already done, which is invest significantly in solar home systems. The north is somewhere where you do have a lot of sun, and these home systems, when government especially intervenes in terms of providing some sort of funding, are very accessible, and they can provide a bit of succor to small businesses. You can be able to power very little small appliances and a light bulb, and probably a small standing or table fan. So, but that's very short term. In the long term, I think we should begin to look at how we can, in a sense, create several grids across the various regions. Now, I've said that people talk about mini grids, regional grids, and it sounds like a very great idea. but there is also the economics part of it. It has to, it's extremely capital intensive, and then you also need to consider the ability to recover that value. And when people talk about state grid, people don't realize how much the federal government is paying currently as subsidy for power. Will the state governments also be willing to pay or carry the burden of that subsidy when they begin to create grids across their own states and across their own region? Because you're not going to create a grid in Sokoto and then expect that the federal government will be responsible for subsidizing that grid. Or would you expect that the people in Sokoto will be willing to pay the value for that power, which may be more than the tariff that is currently being paid on the national grid today? In fact, it would likely be more than the tariff paid on the national grid today, because even the economics of scale that you have, because of the number of people on the national grid, you won't have in the Sokoto states, and all of that. So people need to also understand that there is an economics part. And without government intervention, without government actively playing a role, it may be very difficult to get private sector players that are interested in building grids in specific areas of this country today.
I don't know if you agree with me that there seems to have been some sort of improvement in power relative to the cost-reflective tariff that was implemented earlier this year. And if that is the case, how do you marry that with the concerns of some Nigerians who think they are paying too much for power?
The truth is we are paying more than what we used to pay. But I'm not sure that that's what anybody's concern should be, whether the price has gone up. I think the concern should be twofold. Are we getting value for what we are paying for? And what's the cost of the alternative? I assure you, if you were to run a diesel or a petrol generator in your house for 24 hours, you would spend more than the cost of band A power today. I can tell you that, and I'm not saying this off the top of my head. I have also tried that particular experiment in my own house. So I can tell you that the cost of running a generator for 24 hours is way far more than the cost of the band A supply for 24 hours. And there is no way, because it's, and this is the part that people have always missed. The power sector has always been the chicken and egg situation, where people are saying, oh, we are willing to pay if we see improved service. But the problem is, you can't see improved service if there is no money to make the necessary investment in improving infrastructure. It's the improved infrastructure that will drive improved service. And where would you expect people to find that money from? Because if you go to a bank and say, I would like to borrow money to invest in this infrastructure so that we can see improved service, the first question they would ask you is, what's your revenue projection? It has to make sense. And that's why it's important that tariffs also go up so that people can see that there is value to be generated if you make the investment in the infrastructure.
I hear you, and I get your point, Mr. Aroge. I understand that there's the culture shock that comes with changing from the subsidy regime, which Nigerians have enjoyed over the years. But are we also paying attention to how independent whoever is changing this price is? In April this year, the figure went as high as 300%. I think it may have been tampered with even afterwards. And I understand what you're saying, that if you need power, you have to pay for it. But how accountable, how transparent is this process to be sure that some people are also not just taking advantage of that theory?
Yeah, so that's why you have the NEC, the Electricity Regulatory Commission, and they are very independent. I think the problem is a lot of Nigerians are also not aware of what their rights are and what are the avenues under which they can also challenge some of the actions of the distribution companies. There is a consumer complaint forum. You can also, if you're not even happy with the resolution from that forum, you can also appeal directly to NEC. So there's a lot of process in place that ensures that the discos do not just run amok and begin to run like people without any sort of control. is for Nigerians to be aware of what that dispute resolution process is, and then be willing to avail themselves of it. I can assure you that that resolution process works. I've had cause to observe the sitting of the Consumer Complaints Committee of NEC for one of the discos before, and they were very, very objective in my own view. And I think that the real problem is Nigerians are not aware of all of this. So people just tend to speak on social media, talk amongst their peers, but no one is looking to escalate these issues when they do occur. And therefore, it just looks like there is no independent arbiter. But there is one, and Nigerians should be made more aware of this and the opportunities to then bring forth their grievances.
And most times Nigerians just wake up to find out that the price has changed just at the point of purchase of the power tariff. Unfortunately, this inflation is also happening at the same time where Nigerians have to pay more for fuel, for goods and services. So you understand why, they might have to kick when they see these figures arise. Are there ways you think we can adopt this to our current economic realities in such a way that will make life easier for consumers?
That's very difficult because even the power sector companies are also operating in these same economic realities. And they also, if you look at all of the, and I'm not holding brief for them, but the bulk of all of the network infrastructure will primarily also be imported. So you can imagine also when the exchange rate go up, how that would also have an impact on them and their ability to fund the infrastructure upgrades that are required. So it's very difficult. It's not a power sector specific issue. It's a general economic issue. So rather than focus on the power sector and say, oh, how do we manage the power sector in the midst of this economic reality? It's say, how do we make the entire economy also work better? How do we manage the exchange rate fluctuations? If the rates were much lower generally, the power sector would not use a higher rate in terms of determining what the tariff would be. So I think it's not a power sector thing. I think it's more of our general economic realities. And that's what we should focus on and say, how do we address some of these critical issues in our economy and ensure that we are able to, in a sense, feel the impact. Not even, again, like I said, not only in the power sector, but in all aspects of the Nigerian economy. Gone
are the days where you can leave all of your electrical appliances on and put on your security lights, ad libitum. They said the fear of cost-reflective tariff is now the beginning of wisdom for consumers. We'll see how it all plays out in the coming days. Thank you so much for your thought. I've been speaking with partner Energy and Natural Resources Group, KPMG, and Chairman SSCI Power Sector Group, Martin Zarogie.
Thank you for having me. Have a lovely evening.
And that's our show today. You can watch it again at midnight and at 6 a.m. tomorrow. I am Nifemi Oguntoye.